There is a version of this summer where Carlos Alcaraz is holding the Wimbledon trophy for a third time. A version where he walks into Flushing Meadows as the undisputed king of a sport he seemed destined to inherit. That version does not exist. Instead, on a humid afternoon in April, in the first round of a tournament in Barcelona that barely registers on tennis's calendar of great moments, something small happened. A wrist gave way, and an empire began, quietly, to fall apart. He didn't retire from the match. He didn't even look especially alarmed. Tennis players carry small pains the way sailors carry salt on their skin. It's just part of the job. Nobody in that stadium understood they were watching the last competitive point Carlos Alcaraz would play for months. Not the fans, not the commentators, maybe not even Alcaraz himself. What followed was not a short absence. It was an erasure. Madrid, gone. Rome, gone. The French Open, the tournament where he'd produced what many still call the greatest match of the decade, gone. Queen's Club, gone. And then, in July, the trophy he'd defended twice, the one place on earth that seemed to belong to him more than any other, Wimbledon, gone too. Over 100 days without a single official match. For a 23-year-old at the peak of his physical powers, ranked among the greatest to ever hold a racket, that kind of silence is not just a setback. It's a question mark hanging over an entire career. Because tennis, unlike almost any other sport, has no bench. There is no injured reserve list that quietly holds your spot. There is no locker room seat with your name on it, waiting. When you disappear from tour, the tour does not pause out of respect. It moves on without you, ruthlessly, immediately, and often to the benefit of the very rivals you left behind. And that is exactly what happened. While Alcaraz sat on the sidelines, wrapped and immobilized, two men quietly rewrote the story of the 2026 season. Alexander Zverev, a player who had spent years being tennis's most talented nearly man, the finalist who always found a way to lose the biggest matches, finally broke through in Paris. Jannik Sinner, already the man to beat on hard courts, extended his reign to the lawns of the All England Club for a second consecutive year, virtually unchallenged in the one place Alcaraz had made his own. This is not simply an injury story. Injury stories are common in professional sport. Cautionary, sad, forgettable within a season. This is something else. This is a story about what happens to power when it goes unguarded. About whether a throne, once vacated, even briefly, even for reasons entirely outside a man's control, can ever truly be reclaimed in exactly the same shape it was left in. Carlos Alcaraz says he will be back for the US Open. His body, cautiously, agrees. But the sport he's returning to in New York is not the one he left behind in Barcelona. It has new champions, new confidence, new order, and somewhere between a torn tendon sheath in April and a hard court in Flushing Meadows in August, the biggest question in men's tennis quietly changed. It's no longer just, will Alcaraz come back? It's, is there still an empire left for him to reclaim? To understand what Carlos Alcaraz stood to lose, you have to go back further than April. You have to go back to a teenager from El Palmar, Murcia, who at 19 years old became the youngest world number one in ATP history, a title he took not by outlasting his generation, but by making the sport's greatest champions look, for the first time in years, mortal. By 2022, he had a Grand Slam and the top ranking. By 2025, he had turned that early promise into something rarer, consistency at the very top. 2 Wimbledon titles, a US Open crown defended, and above all, a rivalry with Jannik Sinner that had, by many accounts, become the most electric in men's tennis since the days of Federer and Nadal. There is one match commentators kept returning to, almost involuntarily, whenever Alcaraz's name came up in 2026, the French Open final against Sinner, a 5-set war that stretched past the 5-hour mark, that saw Alcaraz save match points before dragging himself back from the brink. People called it the best match of the decade. Some called it the best match either man would ever play. It became shorthand for what Alcaraz represented, a player who did not lose, even when he was losing. That was the peak. What came next was the descent. April 14th, Barcelona Open, Round 1. A wrist injury during a routine early round match. At the time, described as precautionary, Alcaraz withdrew from the tournament the following day. Late April, Madrid Open, withdrawal. The first real signal that this was not a minor knock. May, Italian Open. Withdrawal. Reports begin circulating of inflammation in the tendon sheath of his right wrist, the same wrist that generates the whipping forehand that had become his signature shot. Late May. Roland Garros, the tournament where he'd played the match of his life just 1 year earlier. Alcaraz does not appear in the draw. For the first time since his career began, one of the sport's 4 majors takes place entirely without him. June. Queen's Club. Withdrawal. Late June/July. Wimbledon. The trophy he had lifted twice. Gone. Alcaraz watches from wherever injured champions watch from, a training facility, a rehab room, a television screen, as the tournament unfolds without its 2-time defending champion for the first time since 2021. 3 months. 5 tournaments abandoned. 2 of the sport's 4 most important events missed entirely. For context, consider what that means in a sport measured in ranking points that decay week by week, tournament by tournament. Alcaraz was not simply absent. He was accumulating nothing, while the players around him accumulated everything. The injury itself, inflammation in the tendon sheath, not a structural tear, sounds almost minor when described clinically. But those close to the situation knew the danger wasn't in the diagnosis. It was in the history. Wrist injuries have quietly ended or derailed the careers of players who seemed, at the time, just as durable as Alcaraz. The name that kept surfacing in conversations around his team was Juan Martín del Potro, a generational talent whose career was defined as much by what his body took from him as by what he achieved on court. Dominic Thiem's name came up too. Nobody wanted to say it directly, but everybody understood the subtext. This is the injury that can quietly end things, if you rush it. So Alcaraz's team made a decision that, at the time, felt almost defiant in its patience. No surgery, immobilization, rest, a conservative rebuild. The kind of decision that trades short-term ranking points for long-term career. It was, by every account, the responsible choice. It was also a choice that guaranteed the throne would sit empty for a while. And empty thrones, in professional sport, do not stay empty for long. Strip away the emotion for a moment, and look only at the numbers. Because numbers, unlike narratives, don't care about sentiment. They simply record what happened while Carlos Alcaraz was gone. By the time Wimbledon reached its final week, Alcaraz's ranking had already slipped from number 2 to number 3, confirmed the moment Alexander Zverev advanced to the Wimbledon final. In tennis, ranking points don't just measure who's playing well, they measure who's showing up. And for 3 months, one of the 2 best players on the planet simply wasn't on the board. Consider what the 2 men who benefited most actually did with the space he left behind. Alexander Zverev, a player whose career had become defined by proximity to greatness rather than possession of it, a finalist who kept finding new ways to fall just short, won the French Open, his first major title, arriving in the 1 Grand Slam draw that Alcaraz, the 2-time defending, the man many considered the favorite on that surface, simply wasn't part of. Then Zverev backed it up by reaching the Wimbledon final, pushing his ranking to a career-high number 2. Jannik Sinner needed no vacuum to succeed, but he certainly benefited from a smaller one. Without Alcaraz to contend with in the second week at the All England Club, Sinner retained his Wimbledon title in straight sets, becoming the only man this season to defend both of the sport's 2 most competitive majors, 2 Wimbledons in a row, a stranglehold on the world number 1 ranking that, without Alcaraz on tour to apply pressure, has faced remarkably little resistance. Here's what makes this more than just bad luck. Alcaraz and Sinner had built, by nearly every account, the most competitive rivalry men's tennis had seen in years. Matches that ran past the 5-hour mark. Finals decided by the finest of margins. That rivalry was, in a very real sense, keeping Sinner honest. Remove Alcaraz from the equation, and Sinner's path to major titles simply widens. Not because he got worse, because the single biggest obstacle in his way stopped showing up. By the time the U.S. hardcourt swing arrived, Alcaraz's absence had stretched past the 100-day mark, longer than an entire clay and grass season combined. For context, that's more court time missed than most players lose to a routine off-season. It's the kind of gap that, historically, doesn't just cost rankings. It costs rhythm, timing, the 1,000 tiny instincts that separate a player who's back from a player who's actually ready. And that's the deeper statistic lurking underneath all of this. Not a number from this season, but a pattern from tennis history. Wrist injuries of this type have a track record of being unforgiving. Juan Martín del Potro, Dominic Thiem, both generational ball strikers. Both saw the same kind of injury quietly reshape, or end, careers that once looked limitless. Alcaraz's team choosing rehabilitation over surgery wasn't just a medical decision. Statistically, it was a bet against becoming the next cautionary tale. The gap in the numbers is stark. A player who, across 2024 and 2025, was accumulating titles at a pace matched by almost no one in the sport, reduced, in 2026, to a season interrupted before it truly began. Whatever Alcaraz does at the US Open, he arrives there having played a fraction of the tennis his rivals have. The math is simple, even if the emotions around it aren't. Every match Zverev won, every title Sinner defended, happened in a version of men's tennis with a missing piece. The numbers don't just show an injury. They show, in real time, a hierarchy rearranging itself around an empty chair. Every great absence in sport eventually asks the same question of the man returning to it. Has the door been left open, or has it quietly closed while you were away? Carlos Alcaraz is about to find out, in real time, in front of the entire tennis world, at the one tournament where he has the most to defend. He arrives in New York as the defending champion. That single fact is both his greatest advantage and his heaviest weight. A title defense implies continuity, the idea that the player who won it last year is simply picking up where he left off. But Alcaraz isn't picking up anything. He's starting over, in the deep end, against players who spent his absence getting stronger. The plan, according to those close to his camp, was never to walk straight into Flushing Meadows untested. The Canadian Open came and went without him, still deemed too soon, too risky. Cincinnati was earmarked as the likely return point, one Masters 1000 event, roughly 2 weeks of live match play, to shake off more than 100 days of rust before the pressure of a Grand Slam. It's a cautious blueprint. It's also an extremely small margin for error. Most players need a full tournament or two to find their timing again. Alcaraz may get one. And what exactly is he walking back into? A world number one in Sinner who has now defended Wimbledon back-to-back and faced almost no resistance doing it. A world number two in Zverev who has finally shed the label of tennis's most talented loser, arriving in New York not as a hopeful contender, but as a major champion with real belief behind him. Alcaraz, for the first time in years, is not the hunter. He is the man being hunted by a hierarchy that rearranged itself without him. There's a physical question hanging over all of this too, one that no amount of confidence can answer in advance. Will the wrist hold? Not just for one match, but across best-of-5 sets, across a fortnight, across the specific torque of the forehand that made him who he is. Conservative rehabilitation protects a career. It does not guarantee that the shot which built an empire will feel exactly the same when it matters most. But here's the part of this story that should make even his rivals nervous. Whatever else this injury cost Alcaraz, it did not touch what made him dangerous in the first place. The instinct for the biggest moments. The appetite for exactly this kind of narrative. Champions returning from adversity have historically been some of the most dangerous versions of themselves, precisely because they have something to prove. Sinner has never had to face an Alcaraz with a chip on his shoulder and nothing left to lose. There are realistically 3 ways this story ends. Alcaraz walks into New York undercooked, gets exposed by players who are simply sharper after a full season of match play, and the empire conversation becomes permanent. A changing of the guard confirmed rather than threatened. Or he finds his rhythm just in time, rides adrenaline and unfinished business deep into the tournament, and reminds everyone why nobody wanted to write him off in the first place. Or, the most dramatic version, he goes even further than that and turns 4 months of silence into the origin story of the most compelling comeback men's tennis has seen since Nadal walked back onto a court everyone thought had already forgotten him. Whichever version plays out, one thing is no longer in question. The empire Carlos Alcaraz built is not automatically his to reclaim. Zverev and Sinner did not hold that throne for him out of respect. They took what he left behind and made it theirs. Getting it back, if it's even still gettable, will require something Alcaraz has never actually had to do in his short, explosive career. He will have to earn it twice. There's a strange kind of silence that surrounds a champion who isn't there. Tournaments still happen. Trophies still get lifted. Rankings still shift, week after week, indifferent to who's missing and why. Men's tennis did not pause for Carlos Alcaraz this summer. It simply moved. And in moving, it revealed something that wins and losses alone rarely do. What a sport actually looks like without its most electric player in the room. What we watched over these 4 months wasn't really about a wrist injury. Injuries happen, careers absorb them and move on, more often than not. What we watched was a live experiment in what power actually is in professional sport, whether it belongs to the man who built it, or whether it's simply on loan, reclaimed by whoever's strong enough to pick it up the moment it's set down. Alexander Zverev answered that question for himself in Paris. A career of near misses finally broken open, not despite Alcaraz's absence, but partly because of it. Jannik Sinner answered it too, in his own quieter way, extending a Wimbledon reign that now looks less like dominance and more like a coronation nobody was left to contest. Neither man apologized for it. Why would they? This is the sport working exactly as it's always worked. Opportunity doesn't wait for fairness. And now the story turns back to him. Not the version of Carlos Alcaraz who once looked untouchable, who made the sport's greatest champions look mortal at 19 years old. A different version. One who has to walk into Flushing Meadows this year not as a king returning to his court, but as a challenger to a hierarchy that quietly rebuilt itself in his absence. There is a particular kind of pressure that only comes from having something and then watching it slip while you weren't looking. Not through failure, not through being beaten, but simply through time passing without you. It is, in some ways, a crueler test than losing a final. Losing a final tells you where you stand against your rivals. This tells you whether you can still stand at all. Maybe Carlos Alcaraz walks into New York, and the rust shows immediately, bounced early, a cautionary footnote in a season that already found its new order without him. Or maybe this is where the real story begins. Because the players who define eras aren't usually the ones who rise smoothly and never stumble. They're the ones who disappear, get written off, and come back changed, hungrier, sharper, carrying something the easy version of success never could have given them. The empire he built is no longer waiting for him. It has to be won back, point by point, match by match, against men who have every reason to believe it's already theirs. Whether Carlos Alcaraz still has an empire, or whether he's about to build an entirely new one, is a question no ranking, no statistic, and no injury report can answer. Only the court can.